this peer support role or this non-licensed role is really a more low barriers way for first responders to receive some form of treatment or intervention, right? Which in the world we live in is really profound and important because there's not enough licensed mental health clinicians to treat the world's trauma, as they say, right? Or first responder trauma, even. And so for me as a clinician, that's been a really valuable pathway because I'm able to, the level of care that I can provide is much more high barriers, right? First responders have to be, in our system, and I have to make sure that they meet medical necessity, and I have to do specific types of interventions that are covered by insurance. And I have a lot more barriers that I'm up against. I'm also not seen as a peer, which can be a barrier for first responders because they typically feel that they need to bond with someone who can understand their life experiences.
You're listening to Precinct 444, a podcast network from the National Law Enforcement Museum. Today we're bringing you an episode from Lifeline, offering a holistic wellness approach focused on supporting American law enforcement, promoting resilience, safety, and survivability.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sonny Provetto, and I am the founder and the clinical director of the Vermont Center for Responder Wellness. The center is a full-service mental health clinic that lives in Burlington, Vermont. And with me today on this recording is three other people who work in the center and play critical roles. And so what I'll do is I'll introduce each one, and they can tell you a little bit about their own experience. And I guess to me, I'm going to start with Bob Lucas.
All right. Thanks, Sonny. So again, my name is Bob Lucas. I work for the Vermont Center for Responder Wellness. I've been employed by them for about 2.5 years now. I came to this position from the Vermont State Police. I did 20 years with the Vermont State Police. And in that time frame, I really recognized the importance of peer support, mental health, and obviously the need for clinical services to be utilized. Certainly the need to go ahead and break down the stereotype that's associated with asking for help. And, through the use of those services throughout my career. And I think I really was able to go ahead and bring that to the people that I worked with to go ahead and make sure that they understood that it was a good thing to go ahead and be asking for assistance or even just to do check-ins. Towards the twilight of my career with Vermont State Police, I was a peer support commander. So I ran the team for the Vermont State Police, had roughly about 25 peer supporters covering the entire state of Vermont. And it was during that time that I really got to know Sonny and obviously the program, the Vermont Center for Responder Wellness. Upon retiring, I came to work for Sonny, and I actually work as a peer support specialist. And really my job, as well as the job of Mark Galle, is to go ahead and go from agency, fire, police, EMS, and mountain rescue agencies to go ahead and really just do check-ins with the individuals to catch that low-hanging fruit before it becomes a bigger issue. Certainly we have a whole suite of clinicians that we're able to go ahead and make referrals to. So if it does kind of rise above, I guess I would say our pay grade, we'll certainly go ahead and make those referrals to the clinicians as needed. So I think it's a working model. I think it's a great model. It certainly clears out a lot of the stuff that doesn't necessarily need to go ahead and rise to the level of a clinician, whereas it can be handled by a peer support specialist or peer support member.
Marco?
Good afternoon. Mark Galle. I started my law enforcement career. Actually, I started my first responder career in 1979 on a local fire rescue squad in my area. At that time, we didn't have any peer support at that point, but we had an informal process where we would just kind of talk about the calls that we went on. And I realized just how important being able to talk about an incident like this is. And it also normalized the fact that even people with much more experience than myself were having the same feelings as I did as a brand new rescue personnel man. And what I found was that was very helpful. I then got into law enforcement in 1983 at a local level and continued along for about 13 years, and then moved over to the state police, where I worked another 14 years on that end. In 1997, I was asked, along with Sonny and a few other people, my wife and a few other people, to be on a peer support team. And having seen the experience and the benefit that I had in 1979 on the rescue squads, I realized that that was really beneficial, so I got involved in that. I continued my career and retired after 27 years from state police. Did a few other things, jumped into post retirement for another 6 years in law enforcement. And then in 2019, Sonny reached out to me and asked if I would be willing to be his liaison with some contracts that we had as a peer support specialist. So I started in with Sonny in 2019, and we've continued on since then.
Great. Thanks, Mark. And to Mallory.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mallory. I'm a licensed independent clinical social worker with the center, and I've been working with the center since 2019. I started as an admin assistant and worked my way all the way up to operations manager, and now I'm a licensed clinician, which is really exciting. As Sonny mentioned, my lived experience with law enforcement is that I come from a law enforcement family. So my father was a police officer for most of my young life, about 25 years before he transitioned into another type of law enforcement role. So I saw a lot of the challenges that brought into a family system, and a lot of the challenges that brought for my father, right? So a lot of relationship challenges, difficulties with emotional capacity, really different and difficult schedules and routines, a lot of burden and responsibility, a lot of perceived responsibility on his part. And it was, even then, it was a different era of policing. So I think it's also important to recognize that my lived experience, I think, came at a time where policing, maybe this is subjective, but it seems that it was easier in some ways. There was more camaraderie, there was more structure, there was more knowns. I think in today's world, policing has shifted significantly into something that maybe even some of us on this panel with lived experience in law enforcement may not even recognize some of the things that people are facing in today's world as, first responders, whether you're in law enforcement or, firefighting or EMS or emergency healthcare professions. So, a lot of my lived experience is in that role as a child of a law enforcement officer, and now working with individuals and families who are impacted by that same system. So I'm really passionate about that work. And I think that peer support has a really big component of that that's really beneficial and different. So that's just a little bit about who I am and what I've done. Certainly not as much experience as some of the other folks here. I'm 27, but I have a good deal of experience behind me, and I've done quite a bit of work here. So looking forward to talking more about this today.
Thanks, Mallory. Bob, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, so I guess Sonny, why don't you go ahead and give a little bit of an explanation as to what the mission of the the center is, and obviously who we actually work with.
Sure. So the center was born out of the state of Vermont actually passing a workers' compensation bill that recognized post-traumatic stress disorder as a compensable injury, and it included our first responders. And the beauty about that is that it really brought to the forefront that the work that our first responders do is actually really harmful. And the interesting thing about in 2017, when we were testifying in the Vermont legislature about passing this law, was that 4 years prior to that, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Conditions had come out, and it actually changed the category of post-traumatic stress disorder and took it out of the anxiety category, made it in its own stress and trauma-related category. And what it added, so the American Psychiatric Association actually added police officers and firefighters and EMTs and paramedics into the criteria of the PTSD, and basically said that not only do you have to be horrified or terrified by a traumatic event, but all you have to do is write the aversive details of a child abuse case on an affidavit or on a report or any kind of document that would repeatedly expose you to the trauma stories of other people. Really brought front and center for us, right, the harmful work that first responders are asked to do by their organization. So the Vermont legislature understood this. I believe we were the first state in the nation to actually pass a compensable PTSD law. And out of that law, then we needed to figure out how we could treat our first responders, because the argument was, and still is today, if we can treat first responders quickly, then we stand a much better chance of keeping them resilient. And now that leads us into a little bit of the research that we do here at the center. So in about 30-something days, we're going to be heading into our third year of research, looking at an EMDR-based intervention that the center has created called the ASAP, the Acute Stress Adaptive Protocol. We are partnering with our collaborators in the UK and in Northern Ireland to see if the ASAP, how effective the ASAP is in intervening early and actually reducing post-traumatic stress symptoms. And what we have seen over the last 2 years is that this adaptation to an EMDR-based protocol is found to be incredibly effective, incredibly efficient, and incredibly safe. And what we see is that this tool that we're using here at the center is capable of reducing people's level of distress anywhere from 52 to 66% in just one use, and on the average, 58.5%. When we look at the actual diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder in the United States, we're looking at a decrease of PTSD symptoms by 44%. So the center is really excited about some of these research findings. And what's really interesting about the ASAP is that Mark and Bob are using the ASAP as non-licensed mental health professionals, catching that low-hanging fruit, as Bob said earlier, and really helping people stay resilient. Now, when this intervention is not doing the work it needs to do because somebody has a level of complex trauma, that's when Mallory and I come in, right? Then they get referred to an EMDR clinician. So the center really promotes the use of EMDR for healing first responder trauma.
Mark, do you want to go ahead and speak to obviously our peer support programs and how they can assist in the effectiveness of a practice such as ours?
What we have a number of clients throughout Vermont, and we basically, like Bob was saying, we do proactive work on our end. We'll stop in and visit with these agencies and just different shifts just to see how people are doing. We'll do ride-alongs with them. So we have that one-on-one interaction and so forth, and just see how life in general is going, personal life, professional life, see if there's any challenges or questions they have that we can help them with to just kind of identify how they're doing. And we'll do that on a periodic basis. And what that's done for us is that we've been able to establish some interest in peer support groups. We've been able to go out there and train them, and we use them as our inside contacts, where they're taking care of keeping their finger on the pulse. And as things progress, if the individual needs a different type of interaction than a peer within the agency, and they want to talk to somebody outside the agency, Bob and I will jump in and determine what's the next best step for them, whether it's just counseling, a little bit of mentoring, or do an ASAP for them to help identify things that may be stressing them and beliefs that may have been established on their end that we can help clear off.
And Mark, I certainly want to come back to obviously the utilization of the ASAP, kind of in a one-on-one perspective, as far as what we do. But Sonny, do you want to go ahead and speak to the ASAP itself, obviously the origin of it and how it came to be?
Sure. So a little bit of my clinical careers after leaving the state police. I was at 9/11, and I had done thousands and thousands of interventions with first responders. And throughout my 22 years of being a therapist, I always felt like I needed something different than the current intervention that's out there. And I became trained in EMDR, and I found the effectiveness of EMDR to be so fast and amazing, and really got to the heart of what was bothering me. And so I'm a consumer of EMDR myself. And I learned that EMDR had a group intervention. And then when I tried to use that group intervention with a police department, I quickly found out how cops like to voice their opinion and say, why does this thing work this way? And why does it say this? And why do I have to tap my knees? And so I quickly knew that I needed to develop or modify something different. And that's the origin of the ASAP. The ASAP is born out of a very well-known, very effective tool called the Group Traumatic Episode Protocol. And the cool thing about the ASAP is that I wanted to design it that peer support teams could use it. And so we really have a trauma confrontation tool, we have a trauma assessment tool, and we actually have something now which identifies the level of stress that people are experiencing soon after a traumatic event. And the good thing about that for an organization is that we get to identify our peers who are really struggling. And, the gold standard would be to have qualified mental health professionals like Mallory embedded with your organization. And when we find those officers who have a high level of distress, you can make a direct referral so you know that they have the right level of care. But the interesting thing about the ASAP is that we have trained over 150 organizations in the country. I have delivered it more than 650 times. And every time we deliver the ASAP, we have people come up to us and say that they had a 20-year-old trauma that they have been living with. And because of it's an EMDR-based intervention, they were able to actually make a resolution of these experiences. And that's what we think is so powerful for peer support in the law enforcement profession, right? There is something that's available to these organizations where their peers can really go out and change the trajectory of somebody's life and also the quality of life that some of our officers are experiencing. Because until now, there really has just been this thing about talk about the event. But we know through the DSM that talking about traumatic material can actually be damaging. And so that's how the ASAP came about. And we'll continue to do the research. And we are currently engaged in an intensive treatment protocol study, which looks at providing 4 days of treatment all in a row and looking at the level of distress and the level of actual resolution that comes from using the ASAP in an intensive model. And now this year, we're going to actually follow these police officers and firefighters for a period of 6 months using the ASAP every month as a maintenance tool and looking to make sure that we can come up with an approach that can help officers deal with the repeated exposure of the job. And so stay tuned to what the research findings are going to say in about 6 or 7 months.
All right. And I guess a natural segue into that would be obviously, Mark, go ahead and if you wouldn't mind just talking about how the ASAP is actually used on a one-on-one kind of event with one of our members, so to speak.
What we do is, like I said, having people in the organization make us aware of people who are having difficult times with something they're been encountering. We're notified of it. Bob and I will sit down with that individual and just kind of see how things are going and see if we can understand what belief may be going on inside of them based on the event. And generally what happens is people tend to blame themselves as first responders. The words you hear of, if only I had, or if I had done this, maybe I could have changed the outcome. And that's turning it all back on themselves. And when we hear that type of thing, it helps me on my end to better identify what needs to be discussed. So we'll discuss that and then we'll incorporate the ASAP. And the ASAP will just kind of allow them to hone in on that belief, that feeling, and bring in some additional information that was locked in their subconscious, which allows them to then make meaning of it and come to terms with it during REM sleep for the next 3 nights. Basically, that's what's going on. So it's a real quick process, 35 minutes, doesn't take any talk on their end. It's all done by the facilitator like myself or Bob or any of our ASAP specialists that we've trained on that end. And it's quick, it's effective. It doesn't take long, and there's nothing where they have to even tell you what's going on because it's all a personal experience. So that's the real positive thing. So people feel safe when they're in the process. We're in an area that we can ground them if for some reason they begin to have an emotional reaction to something that's come up for them.
Mallory, can you just talk a little bit about EMDR from a clinician's perspective for law enforcement?
I think it's interesting to kind of talk about how the peer support and the non-licensed role matches into, like, how does that segue into the clinical type of work that I would be doing. And so something that comes up to think about is that this peer support role or this non-licensed role is really a more low barriers way for first responders to receive some form of treatment or intervention, right? Which in the world we live in is really profound and important because there's not enough licensed mental health clinicians to treat the world's trauma, as they say, right? Or first responder trauma, even. And so for me as a clinician, that's been a really valuable pathway because I'm able to, the level of care that I can provide is much more high barriers, right? First responders have to be, in our system, and I have to make sure that they meet medical necessity, and I have to do specific types of interventions that are covered by insurance. And I have a lot more barriers that I'm up against. I'm also not seen as a peer, which can be a barrier for first responders because they typically feel that they need to bond with someone who can understand their life experiences. And so as a clinician, it's really nice to have a partnership with peer support professionals who can provide that camaraderie to the first responders, but also allow me to hold my professional role. And so in the EMDR work that I've done individually with first responders, I have used the ASAP in an individual capacity, which has been really, really profound and meaningful. I find that the ASAP versus traditional EMDR, the ASAP tends to feel safer, more structured, more controlled, more predictable in some way. The person understands the process. Whereas with full eye movement desensitization and reprocessing treatment, the associations that your brain can make are a bit more vague, and that can be a little bit overwhelming. And something that we've seen with the ASAP is sometimes people's distress will actually go up after a protocol like that. And so when that happens, that's a clue that the clinician may be the next step, right? So maybe what we've unearthed is a first responder who found a resolution with an acute event, but has cumulative stress or cumulative traumatic stress that has compiled and really is not going to be unstuck in a single ASAP session, right? And so that's when I would be stepping in, taking on that particular client or someone like myself and doing that EMDR work. And the EMDR work fits really nicely in with the first responder culture because a lot of first responders are looking for something that works. They're very fact-based, very black and white, very rational, very logical. And EMDR feels like it fits in nicely with that expectation. It does tend to deliver some sort of tangible results fairly quickly, which is encouraging to first responders. Most of their goals are to get back to work, to get back to taking care of their families. There's a high level of responsibility there for them. And so I found that works very nicely, and they're very open to that once they get past some of those original fears about what might come up for them or even the stigma of receiving mental health treatment from a clinician. I think that's really valuable. And I've enjoyed doing EMDR work with first responders because they do it so well. It just seems to come naturally to them, as opposed to maybe some other types of modalities that feel too vague or too long term, right? Like narrative therapy can be difficult for first responders. It feels like they're ruminating or harping on their issues without an action focused mindset. So EMDR pairs those things together really nicely, both resolutions for trauma and action steps that they can take in their daily lives.
No, I think you raised some really good points. As far as the peer supporter's role, I think one of the things that Mark and I have really realized is that we can act as that bridge between the individual as well as a clinician. As you alluded to, first responders are so guarded and not necessarily willing to go ahead and go outside their comfort zone and obviously kind of stick to what they know. And the peer supporter really allows us to go ahead and kind of bridge that and obviously build that relationship. Build that trust with the individuals, and then go ahead and kind of make that gentle handoff to the clinicians and obviously make that recommendation. So I think, again, going back to the peer support role, I think that's a critical component to a mental health organization and making sure that, especially if they're working with the first responder population, to go ahead and get that almost instantaneous buy-in. There are people out there that, will go ahead and identify themselves as troopers or police officers that, I almost immediately begin to trust them just because, we walked in the same shoes, so to speak. Same thing with the fire profession and EMS, even dispatch, even that dispatch world. And again, people share their pains, right? And they understand that. So be able to go ahead in those almost instantaneous conversations with individuals and pick up, right from the troop room or from the dispatch center, and kind of bridge that gap and say, hey, listen, I work with Sonny Provetto. I know him. I trust him, and make that easier handoff. So I think that's pretty cool to be part of, and obviously to do. I guess going back to that, Mallory, you want to go ahead and talk about like what officers can recognize, signs and symptoms of trauma and PTSD for themselves?
There are lots of specific symptoms that people can look for when they're defining traumatic stress. Traumatic stress is a different type of stress than some of the other stressors that people may identify. So we may all kind of resonate with basic stress, which is actually helpful, right? It's a version of stress that's motivating, and it helps us to engage in certain behaviors and fix problems. And then we kind of move up the spectrum into cumulative stress, which is many basic stressors that are not getting resolved, followed by distress, which is when we're no longer able to adapt and cope with the level of stress that we are experiencing. And then there's kind of this breaking point between distress and traumatic stress. Traumatic stress is different. When we talk about this from a diagnostic perspective, we're normally looking at something called a criterion A trauma. And a criterion A trauma has developed over time. It's looked different in the past, but now we recognize criterion A traumas to be a whole variety of different things, all the way from like betrayal trauma, relational trauma, attachment trauma, into accidental injuries or almost death or death-related experiences. And even maybe most importantly with first responders, vicarious trauma. So they've now recognized that trauma that someone else is sharing with you from their experience is also a valid form of criteria to get a PTSD diagnosis. And that was not always the case. Vicarious trauma was not recognized as equal to primary trauma in the past. And so those are some of the basic understandings of how trauma comes about. And then some of the symptoms that we typically are looking for, or that first responders may be able to identify in themselves, could be something like intrusions. Intrusions can take many forms. That could be something like nightmares or flashbacks. It can be intrusive physical symptoms, like all of a sudden you're very cold or very hot, you're shaking, you feel sick to your stomach. It could potentially look like reliving memories unconsciously, like you are kind of in a dissociated or zoned out state and you're reliving a memory that's very traumatizing. So that can be a sign for people that there's something going on that's more than just a basic stressor. Other signs of trauma that people can look out for are high levels of avoidance that are impairing in their daily function, right? So what that could be is, I experienced a call that was a very traumatizing car accident. It reminded me of a car accident I had been in my past, right? And now I'm avoiding that location. I can't drive past that place, right? They could also avoid the activity of driving. I can no longer be in a police cruiser or in a fire truck, right? That feels unsafe. You can avoid specific feelings, specific thoughts, specific people. Another interesting symptom is like avoidance of future goals or avoidance of thinking about the future because it feels out of reach or it feels overwhelming. So those are some symptoms that people typically pick up on pretty easily because it changes the way that they live their life, right? All of a sudden they can't go to their workplace anymore, or they can't do an essential function of their job, or they can't take their kids to school, right? That can be really stressful. Another symptom that we look out for that people can recognize in themselves is something called hyperarousal, which is a state of being outside of your window of tolerance, where you typically exhibit behaviors that people would recognize as high anxiety, high energy, chaotic, overwhelmed, lack of concentration, lack of focus, right? Just feeling very scattered, feeling very escalated or on high alert or on edge. This can be combined with something called hypervigilance, which is when we're really like jumpy, we're perceiving some sort of threat in the environment. So those can be symptoms that people can look out for, like feeling jumpy or reacting differently to something than someone else, right? So Sonny and I may be in the same room and there's a loud door slam in the hallway. He may be able to say, oh, that was a loud door. I might be thinking, what was that sound? Are we safe? What's going on, right? Did someone just break in? That could be a person with traumatic stress. That could be their perspective or their perception. So those are a lot of like the hallmark trauma symptoms. When we start to speak more about EMDR and the ASAP, we start to look at things like negative cognitions. So another specific symptom that I think first responders tend to pick up on most early is negative beliefs about themselves and the world, right? So all of a sudden, it's like we're putting on a different colored pair of glasses and the whole world is colored by that lens, right? So now everything is blue or everything is gray or everything is red, whatever color you want to associate with that, right? And now we have these negative beliefs that are generalized to their entire experience, right? So that could be, I'm not good enough. That could be, I should have done something more. That could be, I am unsafe. That could be, I don't belong, or I'm not wanted, or I'm not valued or respected. Those beliefs can also be expressed to the environment or to the world. People are unsafe. This job is unsafe. This is not an important job, right? People don't value first responders. My organization doesn't value me. I don't feel supported, right? And those negative beliefs come with negative emotions and negative moods. Specifically for first responders, I normally see a lot of shame and moral injury, right? Why couldn't I do better? Why couldn't I change that outcome? What could I have done differently, right? As Mark had alluded to earlier, it becomes a lot of themes of responsibility defectiveness and responsibility action. And that is a very common symptom that first responders experience because they're trained to fix the problem. And when something goes wrong and they feel that they haven't been able to do what's been asked of them, it becomes a shame component, right? A guilt component. And that is very difficult to move away from and can turn into something called moral injury, right? Which is really like damage to someone's sense of self and what they're really capable of. So I think those are really the hallmark symptoms that first responders can recognize in themselves, but also the symptoms that peer support may be recognizing when meeting with those individuals and that clinicians would be picking up on when they're doing assessments and making treatment plans, you know, for those clients to be able to move through those traumatic experiences.
Very well said, Mallory. And one thing I want to, just from my own experience, right? Trauma just also makes us want to withdraw from our lives and from our loved ones. And that can look very subtle and not really jump out at people, right? But all of a sudden, this very slow starting, like losing engagement is in your social circles and especially with family members. And, you know, first responders and police officers are great at coming up with rational explanations why they want to go down and watch the ball game, but they want to take the six-pack with them, right? So all of these really I think critical signs of trauma are really important, but also the real subtle signs of trauma, right? Morale is always a big issue in this profession. And what Mallory's really speaking to is a special section of the post-traumatic stress disorder where it talks about having a marked negative thinking and marked negative mood. And that's where the blame of self and others comes in, as well as how you can see that if trauma gives us this kind of ability to really grab on to the fear structure of the brain, the negative thinking about the brain, you know, thinking about no matter what sometimes may happen in our department, right? Even good or bad, that we always seem to land on something that's negative. And so it's really important, you know, to really do a lot of education in the profession around these signs and symptoms of trauma.
Mallory mentioned moral injury. Do you want to go ahead and just kind of explain what moral injury is and how we see it in our professions?
Yeah, so, you know, it's interesting, and this conversation is quite common amongst a lot of us, and that is, you know, we're okay with the unfortunate fatal car accident, right? We are okay standing at a crime scene, but sometimes we're not okay, you know, knocking on somebody's door and telling them that their loved one is not coming home and not having any ability to prevent that level of emotional grief that a family may experience. And that inability to prevent, right, connects with our ability to be family members or maybe a parent. And we kind of rationalize with the other parent what that level of grief may be experiencing right now, what that feels like. And so moral injury is really defined as the morals and the values that we hold true to the core of who we are as people, that we get exposed to in this job. Another experience of a moral injury would be something that officers are experiencing frequently on a regular basis, and that is people dying of overdoses. And as we stand in those living rooms and we talk to the surviving family members, we also notice who is left behind. And sometimes there's a 4-year-old child left behind who wonders why the person on the floor, being that person's father, is not moving anymore or is not getting up, right? And noticing that we stand in those environments with these other individuals, right? And we take on that grief and that pain. That's the moral injury, right? That we just live with. We don't talk about it. It's hard to explain, but it actually is something that we're affected by way more than we actually realize. And so if you look at all of the subtle tasks that police officers are involved in, even a major crime where the detective has to talk to the family over and over and over and over, that's another experience of moral injury.
I think one example that always comes to mind is the death notifications, right? That's certainly one area that is definitely on the job training. There is, at least in Vermont here, we don't necessarily recognize that as something that needs to be taught at the academy. So, people or officers are really rolling out into the field, through the FTO process, and really learning how to go ahead and deliver that news, that life-altering, that life-changing news to individuals with little to no training, or really know what to do with that feeling afterwards, right? I think that's certainly something that we've tried to address and started to address with the contract agents that we have, the recruits that we work with, and even through the ranks that we work with, making sure that we're not underestimating those, making sure that we're not underestimating the impact of fatal motor vehicle crashes. Those are so unfortunately, they're so common that we often will go ahead and dismiss them as just being another call. And, we're not necessarily looking at the cumulative effect of those types of calls on what, on what that does to our individuals, right? So one thing I want to go ahead and I'll go ahead and change directions a little bit. This is actually one thing that I actually just learned that our center actually does offer is art therapy. I know that one of our clinicians is very well versed in this. I guess, do you want to go ahead and just talk a little bit, this goes to Sonny or Mallory, just a little bit about what art therapy actually is and how it's being incorporated?
Mallory, why don't you take it from there?
Sure can. I was also just going to add to the thought before too, that when we identify with the traumatic experiences that we're witnessing, that can also make the vicarious trauma more likely to be severe. Like if we identify with someone's experience or feel that connects to us in some way, that can be pretty impactful. It's very different than seeing a car accident that you don't identify with, right? Something that doesn't seem familiar to you. It would be a different conversation if the person in the car accident was experiencing something similar to what you had at an earlier time in your life, right? That could be really difficult. But in terms of art therapy is exactly what it sounds like. It's a creative process that patients, clients, participants, guests, members, whoever we're working with, can engage in that help people to manage their mental health symptoms in a variety of ways. And so art therapy is used in a lot of different interventions, a lot of different programs. I think it's still fairly, I'll use the term cutting edge. It's not always accepted as an evidence-based practice for treating specific mental health conditions. I would say that it's probably not talked about enough in terms of treating trauma or helping people to understand their traumatic experiences. I think art therapy is really mostly an intervention that plays off of exploration and processing and developing insight and awareness. And so we use art therapy at the center and with our sister organization with some of the general public. And we really use art therapy to help individuals who are maybe not responding as well to other types of therapy, or specifically like narrative or verbal therapies. If they're really struggling with that sort of expression or that sort of communication, art therapy can be a really great replacement or bridge into recognizing some more of their emotions, some more about their experiences. Art therapy can be a form of connection and communication for folks, like as we talk about like art exhibits and sharing art with other people and talking about your art with other people, right? People may resonate with your art, right? And that forms a connection between you and another person with a similar lived experience. Art therapy can also counteract that hyperarousal that we were talking about before. It can be very relaxing, very calming. engages a different part of your brain, right, than some of these other more chaotic, scattered processes that may be going on as symptoms of trauma. And it's empowering in some ways, I think, for first responders, because it does break down the stigma a bit around other types of therapy, or therapy in general, being silly or ineffective or too time consuming, right? Like, when we actually put these types of therapy into practice, first responders are able to see that there is merit in something other than this traditional version of counseling that they may have in their minds. And so that's kind of my brief intro around art therapy and how it connects in with first responders. I'm not sure, Sonny, if you'd like to add anything to that.
Yeah, so I'll give it a neuroscience lens, right? So one of the things that we know takes place in our nervous system is when we are stressed, is that we lose the access to more diverse expressions. And so if you can imagine being in a career over 20 years that always keeps you on guard and alert and always dealing with things that are negative, right? It just conditions our nervous system to be at that level. And it very rarely has the ability to reset. And so when you think about, so what's the neuroscience around about freedom of expression, right? So the ability to express something without language gives us the ability to explore it, make meaning of it, reflect upon it, and then really add in some of these technical versions of emotional expression that we can't get to if we don't take certain steps to think about our overall well-being, think about, practicing mindfulness, think about, being grateful for your friends, your family, everything that you have that's positive in your life. Police officers spend very little time with things that are joyful, positive, and funny, right? They're constantly exposed to the worst in human behavior. So the expression that we can get through using art, and there are all different kinds of art forms. I'm a carpenter, and my form of art is stepping back at the end of a day of swinging my hammer and looking at something I may have created. What I realized is that when I create things now, I create things that have a certain meaning for me, right? So when I built my house, it had to have a certain feel and a certain meaning associated with it. And that is cathartic, and that is healthy for me to be in that environment. So art can express so many different things. And when we talk about healing from trauma, the ability to heal from trauma is because you have a hard time making meaning of something. The ability to express yourself through art helps you gain a greater meaning or a greater understanding. And it could be the anguish on a face that a police officer had drawn or painted on a canvas. It could be something that's really abstract, but it represents a level of feeling or tension or emotion, right? So art really has this amazing, long-reaching, broad stroke from the words ability to really be quite an effective intervention, as Mallory has said.
And Sonny, I know that, I mean, at least kind of in reflecting back, I know the VA has certainly been using this technique, for many years. Through your network of clinicians, do you find that this is a widely used therapeutic modality?
Actually, I would say no, but we use it in our sister organization. And when the center actually ran its IOPs, we did have art therapy as a component, and officers really took to the idea of asking them to draw something which may represent something they may not have language for. And so trauma gives us this other gift called the inability to put words to our feelings, right? It's called alexithymia, right? So the ability to use some art medium to express what I'm feeling or what I would like to feel is just another avenue of meaning making, which I think is really important. But to answer your question, Bob, it's all not that popular. And Mallory talked in the beginning, right? Some people may think that it's not evidence-based, right? But what we should say is that it's definitely practice-based evidence, right? We know that when people practice art or any form of art, that there is definitely a cathartic effect.
And then what's the feedback from the people that actually participate in the art therapy? And this is both for Sonny as well as Mallory.
Do you want me to share some on that, Sonny?
Sure.
Yeah, so what I've seen in the work that I've done with art therapy is that it tends to speak to people differently. So a lot of what Sonny has said is really true. I get a diverse range of feedback from different people. I've certainly met clients who are like, that was really stupid. I don't think that was helpful, right? Like that happens. Not every therapeutic modality is going to work for every person. And there's a lot of stigma around like these different types of therapy, right? When we think about first responders and coloring a picture, right? We could probably come up with some of those things in our mind that might be reasons why they wouldn't take to it. So sometimes the feedback is negative. Sometimes the feedback is like, this doesn't seem helpful, right? Like this doesn't help me change anything. I think it's important that we validate those perspectives, especially within first responder culture. However, I have had opposite experiences where people almost have an epiphany where they're able to make meaning, right? And then they're like, wow, I've really never recognized my emotions in this way, or described them in this way, or expressed them in this way. I've heard feedback from participants that's around the connection that it brought them to other people in the groups that they were working with, or other people that were also practicing art therapy, you know, seeing their pictures and what was coming up for them, the way that they expressed themselves. Because it's different for everyone. Some people do art very symbolically, like Sonny was bringing up, right? Like carpentry symbolizes something, right? There's something about that that's cathartic for him. It could be coloring a picture. It could be coloring in a coloring page. It could be using clay, which is a very somatic and touch-based experience. You know, so people really respond in all different forms. But I think the most important takeaway is that, like, at a bare minimum, most everyone says that it's relaxing and it's informative. Right. So there's a relaxing component. There is a calming component. There is a way that this engages our rest and digest or our parasympathetic nervous system to kind of slow things down. It can help with mindfulness to stay in the moment. I hear that from a lot of folks, like just coloring in session while you're talking to me helps me stay grounded. It helps me stay focused, right? It helps me stay present, which can be a challenge for people who are experiencing trauma. Sometimes they're dissociating, they're having an intrusion, they're really escalated. So, you know, art therapy can be used in a variety of ways, and people seem to take to it quite well once they get past that initial stigma or that initial interpretation that it will not work, or that it's stupid, or that it's embarrassing, humiliating in some way to create art. It's a wide range of different kinds of feedback. But something else I can say about art therapy too that I think is really interesting is that I see components of that. As much as people say it's not evidence-based, I see components of art therapy being used in protocols like EMDR and the ASAP, right? Because in EMDR, when we have people who are struggling with blocked memories or fragmented memories, some of the interweaves that we can offer them is like, can you change the color of the memory? Can you change the distance that you are from the memory? Like, you know, are you far away? Are you looking down on it from above? Are you looking at it from below? Right? Visualization, I would say, is a form of art therapy in some way, to be able to draw a picture of what a safe space would be for you, or to be able to draw a picture of what it feels like to be in an adaptive future, right? Like all of these things are ways that art therapy is used in other protocols that is very evidence-based, right? And so I think that's important to mention, is that we see art therapy being used in sneaky ways in other types of treatment forms, you know, and it works well. Like I've had clients that are blocked, they can't access memories, and I ask them to change the color and they're able to access something, right? And so, you know, imagine if someone could draw a picture of an adaptive future and that means something to them, right? Where an adaptive future may not have been available to them before. So I think that's important to say about art therapy too. It's seen in other interventions and it works well for those types of things, you know, and I think that's important to recognize.
Yeah, I also think that the old saying, "A picture's worth 1,000 words," really gives us a lot of information that officers can express themselves when they can't necessarily, you know, put the words on paper or communicate that to somebody else. So I really find an incredible amount of value in, as Mallory, you said, doing something with your hands, with your body, to have an opportunity to express something, whether it's in metal, whether it's in clay, whether it's in paint. Like I think the idea of art really gives somebody the freedom of expression. And one of the things that I think is critical in healing from trauma is the ability to express and make the feeling real. right? And as long as we avoid it, as Mallory said earlier, as long as we avoid the feelings, as long as we avoid the images, we keep that traumatic stress percolating in our lives. If we can get it out and get it on paper and stand back and look at it, right? We've made it real. We've brought it into the present. And when we're in the present, and this is something that everybody should always remember, when we're in the present, we're only really being affected by what's in the present right now. But most of us live with one foot in the past and one foot in the present. And that's what traumatic stress does. A traumatic stress is stress that affects us in the present from experiences that happened in the past. And I think art is a way of acknowledging, bringing it into the moment, stepping back from it, being able to look at it and then reflect on it, gain greater meaning of it, different perspective, right? So it really has so many different benefits to it. And what we use in the ASAP and in the MDR, we ask people, give it a name or draw a picture, right? That represents the thing that you are going to work on. So we're always kind of incorporating this little thing about it. Doesn't have to be a word and you don't have to say it. So that's my 2 cents.
We have just a couple minutes left. I guess I just want to go ahead and leave time for closing remarks. If anybody has anything left, obviously I'll certainly provide contact information for everybody, but just want to go ahead and check in. Sonny, do you have any closing comments?
Well, listen, I think, first of all, it's great to have us four on a screen and talk about something that we're really passionate about. And I learn from Mallory all the time, right? So I got a couple of new tricks in my bag right now. And the other thing I think is the fact that peers are front and center with the clinicians, right? Like I don't see any of us at a different level. And I think that's really important for other police officers who may be listening to this to recognize that, yeah, you can be a clinician and yeah, you can be a peer, but the reality is that the work that we do is all to support our police officers, both current officers and retired officers. And let's not forget our retirees for sure.
Absolutely. Mark?
I just want to say that the experiences I've had working with the clinicians themselves made my peer support role much easier. And I realized that I could be a mentor. I had similar experiences. I could share that with people. And that was really very helpful to them. But it always made me feel that if for some reason I needed a higher level, having that interaction, having the support of the clinicians made me willing to be able to go out and deal with people on that end. Plus, it didn't scare me as much because I knew that if anything did come up, I could ground people and get them stabilized and then bring them to the next level. And that made it much easier for me to feel comfortable in that role as a peer support specialist, not having a clinical background and wondering, am I doing things that are going to be positive on that end? Am I going to challenge? Am I going to harm someone? And just having that clinician to fall back on was very reassuring and very comforting for me.
And Mallory?
Very brief. I guess my final remarks would be to kind of help us break down the stigma. So if you're someone that's watching this or someone that is participating in these events around art therapy and first responders, or really any sort of treatment with first responders, tell other people. Tell your friends, tell people that you work with, right? Spread the good word about taking care of ourselves, about self-compassion, about doing what works regardless of the stigma, right? The more that we can talk about this with other people, the more that we can spread these ideals and these successes, the more people will conform to something that will actually help them, right? So a big mission that we have at the center is to break down the stigma. Everybody deserves help. Most of us need help. I need a lot of help. I'm sure there's a lot of people out there that do too, right? And so do whatever you can to share what works for you and share it with other people. Art, like we said, art's a great way to connect and communicate. So if this works for you, tell other people, and thank you very much for having us. This has been a really great conversation.
Yeah, I think just to go ahead and piggyback off that, I think one of the things that Mark and I always say is we don't care necessarily who you're talking to, whether it's a clinician, whether it's a friend, whether it's a peer supporter, as long as you're talking to somebody, right? Obviously, that's the key thing for people to take away from this. On behalf of the Vermont Center for Responder Wellness, I think we would like to go ahead and thank the National Law Enforcement Memorial Fund for having us on. Obviously, great work being done by them, and thank you for providing us this opportunity to go ahead and speak with you. If you do have more information, or if you do want more information on any of the topics that we talked about today, definitely reach out to me, Sonny, Mark, or Mallory. You can reach us at vtresponderwellness.com. Also, just through the normal website, Vermont Center for Responder Wellness as well. So thank you so much.
Please subscribe to Precinct 444 on your favorite podcasting platform to stay connected and to receive our latest content as soon as it drops. We would love to hear from you. Send in your questions, comments, and feedback to precinct444@nleomf.org. You can help us make our content even better. The National Law Enforcement Museum is located at 444 East Street Northwest in Washington, D.C., and is dedicated to telling the story of American law enforcement. We expand and enrich the relationship between law enforcement and the community through educational journeys, immersive exhibitions, and insightful programs. Find us online at lawenforcementmuseum.org and stay tuned for more podcast content from Precinct 444. Until next time, stay safe. We'll see you at the precinct.